Hey, Practice Biopsy. I've got Dr. Agarwal here today, and he is a great member of the Practice Biopsy community and someone who is also taking the Practice Biopsy CE course. Today, he's going to share his story with you guys, and it might be something that a lot of you relate to because all of us dentists, we might think one day we want to own a practice, and if we do, well, one day, um, if we think back, we were just an associate trying to make our way. So we're going to look into his story a little bit today. Um, why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself, say where you practice and how big is your practice? Did you buy one? Did you start it from scratch? Just kind of how did you get into where you are?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me here, and as I mentioned before, the real goal here is to, just share my experience so that, others can kind of learn from it and see if, any part of that story kind of applies to them as well. I'm a single private practice owner. I have just one practice. We started the practice from scratch. It was a startup practice in a sense, but was built out of a second gen office. So people already kind of knew that there's a dentist there. That dentist was a pediatric dentist. Moved over to a different building, a bigger building, and we got to know about the space, refurbished it, but started from zero patients about a year and a half ago. Prior to that, I'd been an associate for about 6 years, almost 5.5, 6 years. And that was in Ohio, where I was in the same office for about 5.5, 6 years. And the timing felt right to make that change, make that jump into practice ownership. And when that opportunity presented itself, I took it on.
What made you said you were an associate for 6 years.
Uh-huh.
When did you know that being an associate for 7 years would have been too many? When did you know?
That's a great question, and we can get into that story, but it's a long story, but I'll kind of just sum it up. I knew within a year or two that I wanted to be a practice owner, that I did not want to be an associate for the rest of my life. The real holdback, essentially, which may not apply to a lot of people, but may apply to a few people, is we had immigration concerns, and we still do. So essentially, I'm not a permanent resident of the US and I'm not a citizen of the US. And how immigration laws go is they do not allow you to be a practice owner and work in the same practice because essentially you're sponsoring your own work permit. And
Hmm.
that's against the immigration laws as it stands today. So I had to wade through and go through, and we're still going through a lot of that immigration process. But at 5.5 years, things changed on my petition for permanent residency, via which I was able to have my own business and work in it. And
Nice.
that's what I meant. Like as soon as that opportunity presented, which was, the immigration laws allowing me to do what I wanted to do, I took that opportunity and started my own practice.
Nice. How did you decide to do that startup or that pseudo startup versus buying like a big practice that was up and running already?
Yeah, honestly, I was open to both. I had a really flexible mindset to it, I started looking around summer of 2022 is like, hey, I want to start getting into practice ownership. And I took courses where I learned about practice acquisition. I took courses like yourself, the one that you have, which was really amazing, and which helps you understand about, all the ins and outs of practice ownership, whether it's a startup or acquisition. And I kind of equipped myself with a lot of knowledge in terms of, when should you look for an acquisition versus when you should look for a startup. And I was open to both. And even if I think about it now, if I'm thinking about it now, knowing what I do or knowing what I know, I would be open to doing an acquisition or a startup. It just depends which one works well for you in that situation. Also, it really matters as to what your vision is moving forward. What you think about where you want to be 10, 15, 20 years with this practice. So for me, like I said, I was flexible with both an acquisition or a startup. And I had an opportunity for an acquisition and I had this opportunity for a startup
Mhm.
based on my vision, based on my situation at that moment. The startup just made a lot more sense. And that's what I went with.
Nice. With your startup, how did things start up? You said you're about a year and a half in. Now that you're kind of more established, how does your just like broadly your take home income that you expect for a year compared to when you were an associate?
Yeah, so honestly been pleasantly surprised by that. You know, as an associate, I was like I said, almost for 6 years. So for the last 3 years of my associateship, I was taking home anywhere between 400, 450,000. I was working 4.5 days a week, never worked weekends, and didn't have the stress or, the responsibilities, I should say, of managing an office. Um, so as a business owner, that first year obviously wasn't nearly as much, but we're pretty much on par to doing the same amount as a business owner now in year two.
Fantastic.
And and we still haven't finished that year two as yet. So
Fantastic.
I
That's
expect
great.
to be doing better. Just, financially, I feel like I would be doing better in year two than I did ever as an associate.
Mm.
Um, but I don't think that's really what the crux is. I get to practice the way I want to.
Yeah,
I
that's
get
what I
to
was gonna say. I was gonna say like a lot of dentists and humans in general, like if they were making 400,000 a year, they wouldn't want to rock the boat and change things. So despite making a really good living as an associate, what was your driving factor to say, I want to be a practice owner?
Because I felt my growth was stagnant as an associate. I felt like I'd achieved the most I could within that associateship, within that company's the DSO structure. And in terms of like growth potential, there was no more room to grow personally, professionally, and even financially. And I felt like I I took a leap of faith on myself. I trusted myself and my skill set, and I was like, even if I get into practice ownership, the least I can do is what I'm doing already here, but I have a lot of room to grow, and that really allowed me to do that. And I can understand where there can be a lot of apprehension about like, hey, you're making 400 a year, no responsibilities, you're an associate. Why would you take that and how would you take that step? I really have to give a shout out to my girlfriend who's also a dentist. And she kept the house running and she kept paying the bills for that first year, which allowed me to really focus on my practice. So, I think that's a big part of why I was able to make that decision.
Nice. So being in the practice biopsy group, you know that in general we put a lot of focus on the principles of like lean and mean, but not every dentist who's like in practice biopsy does 100% lean and mean practice. So what aspects of your dental practice would you say like you run pretty lean and mean based on those philosophies? And which areas do you think maybe you're a little less rigid about that? Maybe you splurge, maybe you don't watch the numbers as close just because it's a better fit for your practice style. Where do you think you're not lean and mean, and where do you think you are lean and mean?
So I try to be lean and mean anywhere I can, but I also weigh in the pros and cons, or I guess the ROI. So what that means is if I know that I can, for example, I know that you still do PBS impressions, and a lot of dentists do that very successfully and efficiently and in a lean and mean way. But if I know that with my patient pool, with my patient skill set, and the way my culture is developing in the team, if I get a digital scanner on board and I can make that productive, then I'm going to be open to investing in that. So I think for me, the way I look at things, D'Angelo, is I'm open to spending the money on it if it's making me money. If I'm going to spend $100 and it's going to make me $200, I'm more than willing to do it as long as I'm still working the same hours. I'm still being efficient about it. It's not being more complex for the workflow for me and my team. I'm open to doing that. But when I did start, I was extremely lean and mean. I watched, and I still do, I watch every dollar. I go through my statements on a monthly basis when my CPA sends it over. So I think that's definitely the way to go is to, because every dollar saved is a dollar earned plus tax. So.
Uh, on that topic, talk to in the audience like the dentists who like want to be practice owners, but they're worried it's going to cost a half a million, a million, $2 million to like do a startup, which a lot of consultants, like the big consulting firms, oh, it's going to cost 750,000 to a million. Henry Schein, if you listen to them, it's going to cost you a million. You have a 7-op practice. How much did you spend to get the doors open on your 7-op practice? And just kind of talk to that dentist who's listening and thinks it's going to cost an overwhelming amount. Because
Yes.
remind you, you have you're digital, you have a scanner, and you have 7 ops
Right, right. And I have a CBCT machine. I
and a
have,
CBCT, and you didn't
I
spend a
have
million dollars, did you?
no, no. I have a diode laser. I have intraoral cameras in all my ops. I have electric handpieces in all my ops. I have Cavitrons in all my ops. So not gloating, but to D'Angelo's point here, anybody who tells you it's going to take you $1 million to start a practice is not lying to you. That is true if you go and just listen to them. But there are, I don't want to say deals, but there are opportunities to be had outside of that as well. You just have to be wanting to look hard enough and want to really try to hustle and get that. So for me, our practice is 2,800 square feet. It's 7 ops and everything that I mentioned in there. And my loan is $385,000,
Mhm.
of which 100,000 is working capital or was working capital at
Yeah.
the time.
So
So
so it's really 285 then, right?
yes,
And then you
yeah.
have, for those not as familiar, the working capital is money that you took out as a loan just as a cushion. You didn't actually necessarily spend it.
Absolutely, absolutely. That money is still sitting in my bank. I've never really had to touch it. It's just sitting in the bank as security. It's 3 months worth of 3 months worth of overhead. But yeah, so that's what it took. And there are a lot of opportunities out there. Don't let anybody tell you, don't let Henry Schein tell you, because for me, the build out of my office, the furnishing and just getting it set up from a pediatric office to a general dentistry office was about $155,000. And I made that through a general contractor. And
Mhm.
I got quotes from Benco and Henry Schein and Midwest and a couple other people,
What type of difference are we talking from a quote from a general contractor versus a Shine or a Benco
like
contractor?
anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000 just for the build out. That was
Okay.
just for the build out, not for the equipment.
Yeah.
So
You're
you
already
just
at your million practically after you put
right.
the
So
everything in there.
absolutely, absolutely. So definitely opportunities to be had. You just want to be able to network, look ahead, and
So your whole build out cost in the 100 in the 100,000 150,000 range, right?
yeah, 150,000 was the build out.
Okay.
Yeah,
And then all the other equipment and everything you named brought
right.
it to about 285.
Yep, absolutely.
Nice. Good for you, man.
Yeah.
And then again, that's 7 ops. Like, I think
Uh-huh.
you're a great example because a lot of the time these doctors think that like to open a practice affordably and smartly, in my opinion, you have to cut a bunch of corners and like, have a bunch of cheap stuff and like barely scrape by. And like, no, you've got laser, you've got all, everything you need, electric handpiece,
Right.
CBCT, you got the whole shebang, and you did it well within the normal budget. How did you find your general contractor?
So I think your course has some resources
Some
on general
references, yeah.
contractors in different states. I
Hmm.
know your course also has, resources on other like IT people and
Hmm.
stuff within states. But for me to find a general contractor I was in touch with 3 real estate agents when I was looking. I was in touch with 3 other reps when I was looking. So I was in touch with the Benco, Henry Schein, and Midwest reps. So there were 6 people that I was constantly in touch with before I arrived to this location through one of the real estate agents. And while I was in touch with these people, I asked like, hey, who do you recommend for XYZ? For a general contractor was one question. Who do you recommend for IT? Who do you recommend for supplies? Obviously, Henry Schein said Henry Schein,
Yeah.
and so forth. But again, I think the power of networking and being part, I think at the time when I was looking, I even put out a question on our Facebook group, that we're part of through Practice Biopsy, and a couple of responses. I can't remember exactly where, but a couple of responses pointed me in directions where I could look at avenues and resources to find help. I found a total of 3 general contractors who were experienced with doing medical, dental, and veterinary, buildings and build outs. I took quotes from them and went with my gut feel with the one that I felt would work the best.
Fantastic. Um, with your startup, were there any areas where you felt surprised or underprepared? Like you didn't know enough in a certain area, whether
Yes,
it's
yeah.
working with a contractor or working with a supplier, anywhere where you felt underprepared in your startup?
Yeah, I think pretty much across the board, D'Angelo. And even now, there are like, times would come up and like, wait, where did this come from? Like anywhere from like contractors to suppliers to setting up IT, and not just setting up the practice, but even once you start the practice I mean, you're obviously well into it, so you know all of this. But even now, but I think I'm going to go back to the same thing that I said earlier in this podcast is, it's important to have that network that you can fall back on, and I'm just so grateful to be part of the practice biopsy group and the network, because I know like when I go back to that group, I'm gonna be reaching out to people in the same shoes, people who've experienced what I have, or at least have thoughts on how they would tackle that. And on a daily basis, it's amazing to have that support. So I would say don't let any surprises prohibit you from doing this. Just to give you an example, day one of my practice, I have one hygiene patient on the schedule, and they're at 12 o'clock that day, and I have two hygiene ops, and the vacuum in both of them is not working. And
Oh
we
no.
realized there's a leak, and we had to reschedule our only patient that day. But long story short,
I
contractor
guess
took
at least it was only
responsibility,
one.
right? The contractor took responsibility. We shut down the two hygiene ops for a week. He dug up the whole vacuum, replaced it, and didn't charge me a dime for it. Took responsibility for it. Um, so so yeah. So I mean, lots of surprises, but nothing that I don't think we can deal with the right support system.
You mentioned something about the practice biopsy course that I think not as many people are aware of. And I
Mhm.
know that you're really active in the private support group that we have, the private chat support that we have. And I think you commented before that like the course gets you going, but the private chat is like what keeps giving the value over time. So for the
Yeah.
people not as familiar, um, in addition, specifically speak on the value that you get and your experience with the private support group. Like explain what it is and like how it helps you.
Yeah. So just on that, D'Angelo, the cost, I really don't know what the cost is for that course anymore, but whatever I paid for it when I did, if that cost got me just into that private chat group and didn't even get the course, it would be well worth it. That's how highly I value it. And the course by itself is amazing because it gets into little things that you wouldn't think about as an associate dentist or as a dentist going into practice ownership. Like, how do I write an Indeed ad out? What's going to work? What's not going to work? What is a PLC versus an S corp? Sure, you can YouTube it, but to have all that information right there at your fingertips, it's amazing. But like I said, even if I didn't have that course, and of course, I didn't know this, when I first signed up, and I would be like, "Oh, I'm not paying, whatever it is for this chat group." But for me, even if I just got access to the chat group with what I paid over time, it's worth thousands of dollars, if not more. Like you cannot put a monetary value because like I said, I fall back on that group routinely and get valuable
You're in there.
insights.
I mean, I see you talking in there at least a couple times a week.
Right, right.
Yeah. I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, the chat group was something that we added later. And I think in many ways it's become the most valuable part. Like you said, knowing what you know now, you would pay the full cost just to have the
Yeah,
chat group.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Um, With that said, I like to keep these about 20 minutes, and we're coming up right on 20 minutes. So give some parting advice to any young doctors who are thinking about getting into practice ownership. Like they've been on the verge, they've been an associate for 6 or 7 years. What do you tell them?
Um, the number one thing I'm going to tell you is like just know yourself, understand yourself, do your research, pick the right practice, have a support system that you can fall back on, and just make informed choices. I think as a dentist at 6 or 7 years, if you're saying that, you have the skill set to carry out a bread and butter dentistry because that's essentially what I'm doing is bread and butter dentistry. I don't do a whole lot of I do specialty procedures, but you can be very successful just doing bread and butter dentistry if you make the right choices and set it up correctly. So don't be afraid. Go out there and ask these questions. Fall back on your support system.
Fantastic. All right, Doc. I appreciate your time. I think they're going to get a lot of value for this. Thanks for sitting down with me.
Yeah, absolutely, Angelo. Thank you for having me.
For sure.